October, believe it or not, October exhibitions. My name is Molly Newgarden. I'm the executive director here, and we're so glad to have you all here with us this evening. I'm also delighted that Noelle Mason is joining us this evening, and Noelle will be talking about the exhibition that you see here in this room, as well as in the adjacent room and in the front. She'll be talking about X-ray vision and invisibility, which is the name of this exhibition. So I'd like to start by stating our land acknowledgement statement. We at Blue Sky humbly acknowledge that our programming is being held on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia, also known as the Wimal, and the Willamette or Willamette rivers. I would also like to acknowledge, before Noelle starts, our institutional funders, including the Leonian Foundation, which is really key to us, providing honorariums for our artists so they can bring their exhibitions here. And the Joy of Giving Something Fund, the Miller Foundation, the Regional Arts and Culture Council, the Oregon Arts Commission, our members and our donors, all of whom make it possible for us to do our work here at Blue Sky. And now I would like to introduce our guest artist who came to Portland all the way from Florida, and it's a pleasure for us to be able to host an in-person artist talk. So thank you all for stepping up and showing your vaccination cards as we try this out and try to do the right thing, but we're grateful to be able to do this in person. We're also recording this talk this evening, so eventually it will get onto our website so you can share it with others. So Noelle Mason is a multidisciplinary artist whose work is about the subtle seductiveness of power facilitated by systems of visual and institutional control. Noelle has shown nationally and internationally, including the National Museum of Mexican Art, Orlando Museum of Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. They are the recipient of the Joan Mitchell Foundation Arts Grant, Jerome Fellowship, Santo Foundation Individual Artist Grant, the Florida Prize for Contemporary Art, and the Southern Prize. Noelle holds a BA in Theater and Fine Arts from the University of California, Irvine, and received an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Noelle currently holds the position of Associate Professor of Art at the University of South Florida and is the founding director and curator of Parallelogram Gallery in Tampa, Florida. Please join me in welcoming Noelle.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you so much for everyone at Blue Sky. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I'm just very, very honored to be showing here. So I'll try to be loud enough so that everybody can hear me. Hopefully my theater background will come in handy in this scenario. So yes, as was said, this is an exhibition of work, part of a body of work that I've been working on since 2006, called X-ray vision versus invisibility. Some of you may be familiar with that kind of question, right, which is sometimes offered as a sort of ethical question, like which would you rather be? Would you rather have the superpower of X-ray vision or the superpower of invisibility? And so I like to use appropriation in my work, as you can probably see here, and so often the titles are also appropriated, and so I will not pose that question to you necessarily, but it's something that frames this project in a sort of double entendre kind of way, both as part of popular culture, but also as really asking a question about our relationships and how power kind of influences them, and what types of power, either through resistance one can gain through something like invisibility, but also the way that invisibility makes us incapable of accessing our ability to affect change in society. So there are several bodies of work or several series within this body of work, and I'll kind of go a little bit in chronological order. The work started from some Google searches that I was doing back in 2006, researching new technology that was being talked about being implemented in airport security systems. Now, which is sort of ubiquitous, which is the backscatter X-ray machine, which I'm sure if you've traveled within the last 5 or 10 years, you've had to stand in the little machine and have it scan you. When the technology first came out, it didn't abstract the image of the body the way that it does now. It was in fact like sort of X-ray glasses that they used to sell in the back of comic books, like this idea that you could like see underneath somebody's clothes, and it was much more kind of fidelitous to the body, and so there was a lot of concern about our invasion of privacy, right, in these technologies. And so as I was researching this, I came across these images, which you see around you in the blueprints and also in some of the stickeries, which is was being used on the U.S.-Mexico border to X-ray trucks at random as they were coming in order to capture images which would provide information to law enforcement about contraband or about people who were migrating to the United States illegally. So at the time, I was really interested in cross-stitch as a sort of form that was being used in, or sort of developed in post-war America among housewives. It's a type of form that could be easily communicated because it didn't need a whole lot of, you don't need a whole lot of skill to do it. So it was something that you could learn quite fast and was used in as a hobby and that sort of thing in post-war America by housewives who had not as much free time on their hands as they might have in earlier times. And so, but I was interested in it in relationship to digital images and how the pixel could be translated directly, or how it's a precursor to an idea of a pixelated image, right? And what's interesting about textiles is that, and this kind of shows up in the tapestries, is that weaving was the first industry to be industrialized and mechanized. And in fact, if you know the word Luddite, it comes from a man named Ned Ludd, who was a weaver who basically instigated a revolt against industrialized weaving and got people together to go in and break the weaving machines in these factories because they thought that their jobs were going to be replaced, and in fact they were for many of them. And it created a de-skilling of that process, right? So, so that is kind of a background historically to the use of some of these processes. So yeah, I started doing these counting cross stitches of this work, kind of thinking about the immediacy of mechanized imagery and digital imagery, and the way in which these machine vision technologies really remove our mimetic relationship to photography, a relationship that had been cultivated through Enlightenment and like Renaissance perspectival painting, and then kind of created a desire in Europe to create something like photography that would capture an image the way that Renaissance perspectival painting could do. And so, so that is also like part of the backdrop to this work, is this kind of critique in many ways of an Enlightenment worldview, where there is an impulse to try to remove ourselves in many ways from the image making to create a sense of an objectivity. And so a lot of this work is about taking these machine vision images, which I think attempt to capture some sort of photographic truth, right? And rework them through materials so that the craft of photography and the abstraction that photography provides is like front and center, right? So, so with these works, which take, you know, this is sort of like digestion, like one pixel at a time, there's this element of time that is in kind of distinction or contradistinction to the sort of instantaneousness of these photographic images. And also, the other kind of change or shift that happens is it goes from a medium which is only really meant to exist on a screen as sort of data that is like imaged in the screen, and which in many ways where we focus so much on the content of the images, to something which focuses on the form, right? And this like how the form affects the image that we see. Like I hope that these images, through their tactility, have a sort of humanizing effect in a way, bring attention to the construction itself of these images. The series is called Koyatahe, which is a slang term basically for the process of migration across the border. The images are of, there's two types of imagery. One is infrared images, which you see here, and then the other is the backscatter imagery, which are in these two here. The infrared images were collected, for the most part, from Minutemen groups. So these vigilante groups that sit on the border, basically surveilling the border for entertainment. And so at the time, there was a lot of very active groups that were doing this and were posting a lot of these images online. And so many of them are collected from that source. The images of backscatter X-ray are collected some from the same sources, as many of those Minutemen groups are friendly with the law enforcement groups, and so people in the law enforcement group would capture the images on their phones or on a photograph from the screen and give it to their friends in these Minutemen groups. Later, these images became much more, there was a big flood of this imagery coming in. Through editorial sources, right? I found a lot of these images on as advertisements from the companies that make this technology, who posted on their sites. And then also, there's even an image that I'm working on now that that I obtained through a Instagram page or an Instagram post that Donald Trump's administration made on their Instagram site. So one of the impulses to shift from tapestry or from this embroidery to making photographic processes was just the kind of influx of imagery and wanting to represent them, and also wanting to bring attention to the sort of history of photography and the way in which these machine visions reinscribe a type of Enlightenment worldview, which is about kind of dissecting and categorizing and showing or attempting to show a sort of objective view of the world through oftentimes photographic means. So including right, like medicine, you know, like everything from medicine to the space, our like desire to go to space, right? Like photography would have to exist for these things to for us to be able to do any of these things. So The tapestry here is one of 5 tapestries that I've made, all about the same scale, which are of points of conflict on the US-Mexico border. The one that you see here is of the Colorado River Delta, which used to be much wider and encompassed this entire sort of yellow area. The Colorado River, as some of you may know, is the main water source for the California Imperial Valley and all of the cities in California, which have to be irrigated artificially because of the fact that they're deserts, right? And the Imperial Valley is the largest breadbasket of kind of America, right? There's more produce and things like that grown there, but it's originally a desert, and so all of that water has to be used to irrigate this desert and make it flourish. So by the time that it currently, by the time that it reaches the Gulf of California, much of the year it's depleted to the point where it no longer touches, right? And so there's this sort of water war that has been going on for many, many years between the US and Mexico, like who owns the rights to this water, to this sort of commons, right, that at one time wouldn't have been privatized in this way. These tapestries are woven in Mexico at a place called the Taller de Gobelines de Mexicanos, and they're woven in a traditional, in a style, or in a type of weaving called Gobelin tapestry. And Gobelin tapestry was made in the 1700s, and it was invented in France for the king, and it was invented to reproduce paintings. It has a sort of ability to have a fidelity to the paintings that other processes did not at the time, and it cannot be mechanized. It is not a type of weaving that's done with a shuttle that you may have seen. It's kind of hand knotted, essentially. And so this piece took about 18 months to produce. Two guys, and they are produced for the amount of money it costs a family of 4 to come across the border illegally at the time of production. So that determines the scale of the piece. So the cyanotypes. So I got interested in this process of cyanotype because I was working at the University of South Florida, and we have this atelier there, and they were making cyanotypes for Christian Marplay at the time, and I didn't know that much about the process and got really fascinated by these images that were being produced, and so started to learn the process and thought it was an interesting resonance with the imagery that was coming specifically from the backscatter images. Because if you know anything about the history of cyanotype, it was developed by John Herschel in the 1800s, mid-1800s, who was an astronomer, which I thought was interesting. And one of the first photo books that was ever produced was by a woman named Anna Atkins, who was a biologist who collected samples of algae and made cyanotypes of them. And so it's this sort of scientific categorization of the natural world. And the images that were produced are very much like X-rays because the algae are transparent, right? And so if you don't know the process of cyanotype, a liquid is brushed onto the paper and then exposed in UV light, and whichever area is exposed stays blue, and then the area that is not exposed washes away. So that's how it can produce this sort of wide value spectrum. So the next kind of place that cyanotype was used heavily was in architecture. Blueprints are called blueprints because cyanotype is inherently blue. And it is, so I thought that these images, with the sort of architectural nature of these trucks, had this nice conflation of the two historical uses of cyanotype. And that there's this like interesting and jarring tension between this kind of architectural nature of these images and then the human bodies, the people who are within them. There's some, there's interesting kind of conversation about X-ray and how the invention of the X-ray and its ability to sort of see through human skin sort of dissolves the kind of limits that have so defined and brought meaning to our understanding of the world. And it sort of dissolves these limits and turns everything into, like inside and outside become on one plane, right? The most recent work is the work of the Tintypes, and the Tintypes I started in the end of last year, and was really interested in these objects. They're these beautiful objects, and they are so reminiscent to me of the migrations of early Americans, either in the Great Migration or the Dust Bowl Migration, these migrations to the American West. So I thought it paired nicely with the images that were coming from the US-Mexico border of immigration here in the contemporary time. And so these are made actually all in the darkroom from a computer screen. So I've sourced these images from various places, and then often they're stills from videos. And then I photographed the computer screen itself using an 8x10 camera. And this process, which you may know, is done from start to finish within about 20 minutes. So the plates are made out of aluminum and coated with a black surface, and then they're coated with collodion and sensitized in a silver bath. And then once they're sensitized, between that time and the time that they have to be washed or developed is about 15 minutes. And so you use the actual piece of aluminum as you would a negative. So these are all made in an 8x10 camera, and it's kind of an absurd setup in many ways because it's this giant camera that's photographing a little screen like a foot and a half away from it. And so the light from the screen is really the thing that is, it's not taking a reflection of the screen, it's taking the actual light from the screen, is sensitizing these plates, or is, affecting these plates. And then they're developed and washed and coated to protect them. The video in the next room is a video that is, came out of all of this research and aggregation of material. The video takes appropriated video from both law enforcement and from these Minutemen groups, and pairs it with, and it's infrared video, and all of these are infrared images. And it pairs it with infrared video of coyote hunting in the United States. There is, in many places, there is open season on coyote hunting because of farmers worrying about their cattle or their farm animals. But it's really become sort of hobby amongst a certain group of people to film their coyote hunts from their scope. And the same technology is being used to film people crossing the border. But one of the things that I think is interesting about it, and it's a conversation about this idea of migration and migratory animals that have crossed the border for many millennia, right? That our instigation of offense in many ways is preventing centuries old or millennial old like migrations of not just humans but also non-human animals. And I think kind of brings a little, puts a fine point on the way in which this technology mediates our relationship with other people, with other species, that sort of thing. Does anyone have questions? I'd like this to be sort of more of a conversation than me just standing up here and lecturing. Yes.
You said that you got some of the images from the companies that make the technology.
Yeah.
And I was wondering when I was looking at them, or thinking when I was looking at them, if the companies actually have the ability to make the photos or the prints or whatever higher quality, but don't, because the way it is now, they kind of look like people in a concentration camp or something like that, and very like the other. We can see you hiding, but we don't really want to see who you are. So I was wondering if is there like any evidence for that, for my
evidence for them
like purposely
not
making
them
high
higher
quality.
resolution. I don't know the answer to that question. That's an interesting question, but I think there's an argument to be had that says that, in fact, the mediation is part of it, right? Like that's part of the way in which we are able to exact, my mind goes immediately to something like drone technology, right? And that like part of the way in which you get people to do sort of horrific things to other people is by making them not look like people, right? I mean, there's in philosophy this idea of like the face of the other, and that in the face of the other, you can see the phrase "do not kill me," right? That is like the thing that the face gives us. And by obscuring the face, we have an ability to distance ourselves from the other. So, I mean, I think there's definitely an argument to be made for that.
Dehumanizing.
Dehumanizing. Absolutely.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You were talking a lot about immigration. Like, what's your relationship to that? I mean, personally, in your own life or in your family?
So I grew up on the border, about 4 miles from Mexico, and so I spent my whole childhood going back and forth, right? And I lived in a place where we were, most of my friends, or a lot of my friends would go back and forth living in Tijuana or living in Chula Vista, and I went to school with many people whose families lived on both sides, and it was at the time, it was much easier to travel back and forth, and so there was, it was much more common to traverse that border on a very, very regular basis, but it always had this fascination to me because of how dramatic the changes between the United States and Mexico at that place. And it was confusing in many ways, right? As a child, like you go from a place where you can communicate easily to a place where you can't communicate at all verbally, right? So I think at a certain point in my life, I became kind of aware of my own liberty in moving back and forth over that border, in distinction to some of the people that I was around who couldn't go back and forth over the border by virtue of my U.S. citizenship, right? And so it's always had a place of fascination for me. And then in addition to that, my dad is a cop and worked on the border. So, there is, and he didn't work in border control, but worked with the people in border control, and it was at a certain point there's a feeling of contradiction there within my own family, because we had, many friends who were considered illegals, right? Friends of the family, and there was a tension in the sense that, like, somehow my family justified their sort of belief in having strict borders, but with the exception of these people, right? So it's like, it's much in the way, it's similar to the way in which it's talked about the American South, the idea that, like, there was always the exception to what people thought about the other, right? Like, oh no, like, these people are okay, but this group of people is not, right? And so that was something that was very present to me growing up. I became more aware of and more frustrated by right, these contradictions within my own family. Yeah.
Do the contradictions still persist?
Oh yeah. My mom. So the other side is that my mother is was a citizenship teacher. So she taught the classes that many people took to become citizens, and we always had one of her students living with us at any given time, and it's still the case. My mom still has students who live with her, who fell on hard times or something, and, like, have a room in the house, or yet they are Republicans, like very right-wing Republicans, who are like, build a wall. So yes, those contradictions are still very much there.
For those of you who want to see what it used to be like to cross the border into Tijuana, the opening shot of Touch of Evil by Orson Welles is one continuous live shot of crossing the border. It's one of the most famous shots in film, but takes a lot longer to cross it now.
It does. Not to get in, but to get out.
I will also say that there is a lot of the people who work on the border, the crossing people, there's a lot of complication in their feelings there too. I mean, there was a photographer who rode with the I don't think it was Homeland Security yet, but with the Border Patrol guys.
Yeah.
And he went by and there was this whole line of mailboxes. And he said, well, what are these mailboxes in the middle of the desert? He said, oh, well, that's so that the people who have crossed over illegally, that's where they come get their mail. And then there was no stake out there. And he's like, oh yeah, it's all kind of accommodated at the same time that they're enforcing the rules. They're sort of looking the other way at the same time.
Yeah, it's one of the frustrations about the national debate, I guess, is that the vast majority of people who think they have an opinion on it have never really lived there, and don't understand, like, how important the permeability of that space is. And it, like, growing up in California, it's like the entire California economy is built on immigrant labor. And so fifth largest economy in the world is because of immigrant labor. And the closing of the border is one of the reasons that people stay in the United States. Like, people don't want to come up here and, like, live here away from their families forever. They want to be able to go back and see their families and live with their families where they're from. Most people don't move away from their home for reasons that aren't quite tragic. And so it's, I think that this conversation is so much more complex than we see it in the national media or the way it's used politically. And so I guess I'm interested in making work that allows us to sort of sit with the complication of it and the contradiction of it, and realize, like, how visual culture, specifically photography, like, contributes often negatively to this conversation, right? It makes it, oftentimes the photograph is used as an empty vessel that can be sort of appropriated for whatever kind of ideological means, you want, yeah.
What do your parents think of your work? What do they see when they look at it?
Well, oftentimes they say to me, why can't you make something that uplifts people? But they're supportive. I mean, I have to give them credit, like, even though we disagree on pretty much everything politically, they are supportive of my practice. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could clarify a little bit about the title of the works, and if invisibility is a stand-in for like ignorance or like willful ignorance. Is that? I just
Yeah.
What those two terms mean to you?
Yeah. Well, there's a formal sort of, like, that is an interesting take I had not thought about. So thank you for bringing that. To me, it has a very formal relationship, right? Like, there's obviously a formal aspect of the X-ray, and also with work like the ground control work, like the idea that a map makes, basically renders invisible most things except for a small subset of information, right? And especially an image like this that's made by a satellite that takes a heat image of the Earth, which it's not an image, right? It's data. It's a data set that then gets assigned a spectrum of color that then renders a sort of total abstraction in many ways of the place that it's looking at, to favor only something that's useful to, in this case, geological information or information about land use, and that sort of thing. And so that invisibility is the invisibility of like the lived experience, which very much like goes into why I made this into a rug and not like a tapestry that hangs on the wall, right? Is that the idea that you can approach it in what feels almost like a domestic space. It creates something that you can walk on. The piece is called ground control, right? So definitely like reinforcing this idea of like not only NASA's relationship, right? Like ground control is NASA, but also ground control as what is physically happening on the ground. I like the idea that it can create a sort of limit space where you feel like maybe tempted to like cross that artistic border that you're not supposed to cross. Like we literally have a line around here. And so that's the invisibility to me is like a double. Invisibility can be both powerful, but also remove power from your political power from you, right? And so that's sort of the way that I was thinking about it. And then, I mean, X-ray vision is, to me, that is like all about power, right? It's all about like having the ability to see, who has the ability to see, and how much do you have the ability to see, and how much, like where are the boundaries to that ability, right? Because in many ways, those boundaries have been completely eradicated. Oftentimes, you know, in the medical industry, it's like our bodies are completely imaged in many ways, right? In a way that I think at another time would have been completely like earth-shattering to a sense of sort of the limitation of, yeah. Yeah.
I'm very intrigued by the X-ray part of it, because I've worked in healthcare, although I'm not a radiologist or anything. But it's so, there's so many layers that I felt in looking at the work, because of course the X-ray is stripping them, it's stripping away their shelter and their hiding place, and it's stripping away their clothes and their, I mean, in that sense, it's sort of dehumanizing them, but to me, when I looked at them, I went, oh my God, these really are X-rays. You can see their lungs, you can see their bones. I mean, to me, it was this tender feeling like, they're just people like me.
Yeah.
That's how I would look if someone X-rayed me, you know, and so it was, in a funny way, it actually rehumanized very much the situation to me, you know.
And that's part of the reason I wanted to change the scale. Like, I had always, like, when I started in making the blueprints, the idea was to start pushing the scale. Because I do think that a scale shift allows you to have a more one-to-one relationship with the object, and you can really pick up the detail of the X-ray itself, because I do think exactly, like, it has both a dehumanizing effect, but it also has a universal effect.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
In that, like, I can see myself in this image in a way that maybe I wouldn't be able to if it was more just about identity.
Yeah, there was this vulnerability there that I mean, I really thought, that's me, that's all of us, you know.
Yeah, and there's also like elements to, the blueprints all have a subtitle that relates to the history of painting. And I've been really interested in like Orientalist painting and the strategies of the way in which Orientalist painting gets kind of transferred into some of these images. One of the strategies in Orientalist painting is to look at the back of somebody, right? Like you would see a painting of people like the snake charmer, or like these kind of traditional Orientalist paintings where the painter removes himself in many ways from the painting. In paintings of Europeans, the Europeans would look at the painter in the painting, right? Like the painter would paint them as if he was part of the group. But in Orientalist painting, the painter steps outside of the group and tries to make an image that is like supposedly objective, right? Or it's romanticized, obviously, but an objective romanticism, or at least that's the effect that move has. And so you can see that in some of these images, like this one here, right, really relates to that Orientalist perspective of painting, where it's like, I'm observing a scene, I'm not like part of the scene. Yeah.
Is there any idea behind the porcelain thumbtacks?
Oh yeah. One does not make hundreds and hundreds of porcelain thumbtacks. So you'll notice, yes, all of the images, all of the cyanotypes are held up with these porcelain thumbtacks. So I'm interested in the way in which bureaucracy intersects this, how we are both, we have a bureaucratic identity now, right, through, within like global capitalism, like this bureaucratic identity exists somewhere outside of us, but exists in a way related to our ideas of ourselves. And so the thumbtacks and the use of this size paper, which is 17 by 22, which is a common size paper for, it's like the 8.5 by 11, the 17 by 22. This is like the paper that's cut out for like bureaucratic use, essentially. So, and then the way that they're tacked to the wall instead of in frames is supposed to sort of evoke a kind of boardroom or office space or something that has this sort of bureaucratic feel to it, and the pushpin is that, like the marker of that.
It's more that they're there for analysis rather than artistic.
Right.
Yeah.
But it also has this wonderful ability to turn the paper into an object instead of just like an image.
Mm-hmm.
So it curls, it's going to do some weird things on the wall depending on the humidity, which you have a lot of here. So, so it really changes the images to an object in a way that is important to me, that it it runs interference, right, through the form of the form runs interference to like the content in a way, creates a resistance in some way. And the porcelain, I mean, all of these are craft processes, right? So, like, it's important to me, this idea of, like, the idea of the craftsman and like, the this pre-capitalist idea that one would have would own their labor, right? And would have a process that they would see from the beginning to the end, that they would be not de-skilled, but skilled, in fact, and so, I think craft kind of alludes to this attempt to reestablish a connection with our own labor.
If there are no more questions, thank you. We got one more.
Well, I was wondering, the images are, objectifying the people crossing the border and so on. And I'm wondering, like, if we're doing the same thing here by putting them in art, in a gallery in Portland of all places, is that just another version of the same thing?
I mean, that's a good question. It's a question that I grapple with. I tend to think that there's something about, I'm very like Walter Benjaminian in this idea that like the gallery can provide a place where we can have a conversation with people that I do not know about this very topic. So it can be a meeting place. It can also be a place where we can consider these images outside of a contextualization that just goes through sort of either entertainment or like capital or something. It is a conflict that I'm inherently interested in, this idea that like, what is it to make an image? Can this image be saved? What I mean by saved is, can it be turned on its head or turned in a way through form? And maybe it can't, but that's my attempt,
Well, and if I can, as a gallerist, if I can also answer that question, which is that for us, we're very conscious of the fact that we're a photography gallery, and that photography is a one-to-one mapping of something in the real world. And if you look at a picture and you can't tell what it is, your first question is, now what am I looking at? It's very much, you feel you're looking at the world. And I think, the photography is literally looking at the world through somebody else's eyes. I mean, in this case, it's looking through a machine's eyes, but but that photography is inherently empathetic. And that if you think about what do you know about some country that you haven't lived in, what you mostly know about it is the photographs you've seen and the movies that you've seen that are set there. And movies are, of course, great because you're not just walking on the sidewalk, you're sitting in somebody's living room listening to their conversations. So I think that photography and its offshoots of film and video, I think, are sort of the main engine for empathy and understanding the other as similar to you in the world right now. So I think a photography gallery is a great place to have the context for looking at this.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, just to add to that, or to understand that within photography itself is this unbelievable contradiction, right? That it can both do that and it can do something horrendous, right? It allows a kind of violence on the world that has never existed until this most recent time. And so it does both. And I think, to me, that's something, a place to have to grapple with, that it's not virtuous, and it's both virtuous and evil, or has the potential to be wielded in really extremely different ways, right? And I'm interested in trying to figure out where those two things come together. And I don't know if I've succeeded or failed, but that's what I'm trying for.
Well, this is part of the reason why I was asking what your parents thought about it, because I think it would be possible to look at these and see them in terms of their initial use, to say, oh yeah, this is great, look at how we can capture these people
Yeah.
now, they don't come in and destroy our country. So that's why I was sort of curious, it's like, do they sort of
I
see them
think
through
it
their
just-
eyes or through your eyes and forgive you?
I think it disturbs them a bit.
Mm.
You know, they're generally kind of disturbed by my work, and that is, I'm good, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Because I can't have a verbal conversation about it. Like, that just evolves into nonsense like fact checking, which is like, you know? And so, you know, in many ways, like, I'm trying to make work that could get to somebody who has their belief system, and twist the, like, shiv a little bit, you know what I mean? But in a way that doesn't go through rhetoric.
I mean, it's very interesting when you're talking about like the dynamics of power and invisibility, in looking at the work, because in a lot of ways, like your relationship to these topics, your opinions on these topics in themselves almost feel invisible. So yeah, I was just thinking about like, because it is this interesting like craft technology making data, and it's like you're presenting that all to us without any sort of narrative.
Right.
So I think if your goal is conversation, I think, events like this combined with the work is really effective. But I do wonder if you feel safe in your own invisibility.
Maybe.
Where do you feel powerful?
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a Marxist, but I like Marx's critique of capital.
Yeah.
And believe in a kind of project of universalism that he instigated. I know like universalism can be a dirty word after Adorno, but I think maybe Adorno was wrong. Like maybe we need to, like find ourselves all as these lacking subjects, and that like that lack is the universal, right? Not some kind of positive universalism, but some kind of negative universal. And so that, yeah.
Well, and it's nice that, I mean, for people who have to, from before this point, but basically this point, they have to be invisible the whole time that they're in the US, or otherwise they're deported. But they also have needs and have a situation that people need to know about. So they can't do it themselves without fear of being deported. So it's like you're kind of lending your US citizenship to say, let me speak up for the people who can't speak for themselves. And say, I want you to see them as human because they can't assert their humanity without being deported.
I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, but.
Well, then maybe that's my job. Maybe that's my job, is make you uncomfortable.
I will say, and I happen to be from the border too. I'm from a tiny town in South Texas, about 45 minutes from the border, from a town called Harlingen, where there's a border patrol processing center right across the street from the high school that I went to. I will tell you, from my own experience, coming from an immigrant family now 4 generations deep, so I don't know how close to the border I am anymore. What I got from this particular exhibition was a sense of liminality, a sense of just like, I think the one thing that struck me in particular, I thought, was the x-rays gave me kind of were very reminiscent of the casts of people who had been burned alive at contact.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that in a sort of poignant way, we have these casts of people suffering, but it's kind of their individuality and identity has been sublimated so that they're just empty shadows of what a human being used to be. Whereas this is an ironic thing because these people still may be very much alive.
Yeah.
Or dead. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who die in them things.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very, very telling and very poignant way of depicting humanity. The other thing I found was very, very brilliant and masterful was this tapestry on the floor. That speaks a lot to the liminality of the border itself as a thing to be walked on.
Yeah.
Without perhaps even thinking about how ancient the land is, how the many, many groups of indigenous folks, and especially on the Colorado River, you think of the Yuma people, Tohono O'odham, people who were there long before there were any other white folks, were just across the border back and forth, and knew how, and by the way, also knew how to regulate water use according to the septic system. So, like, to be able to see this both as a colonized person, as a person of indigenous descent, it's like, I think you kind of hit the mark. I feel like I kind of got my ass kicked, you know, psychically from being able to be in this place where you're confronted by the kind of orientalizing way that you present the art, but also in a very beautiful Western humanizing sort of way. It reduces the suffering to a point where it's apprehendable, but not necessarily in such a visceral way. It's visceral, but it's not visceral at the same time.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think that there's this element of a lot of photography. I mean, I feel like I can't talk about photography without thinking about the pornographic. Like, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to make an image that is pornographic versus an image that does something else? And I don't know. I mean, that is like, it's mind-bending to think about that, because I do think that, you know, oftentimes, especially with images of trauma, they have a sort of pornographic effect, and it's the only way that I can kind of explain that effect. It's something salacious, it's something to look at for titillation, and not, and that like circumnavigates critical conversation or something, and goes straight to sensation. And I'm really trying to take images that maybe I feel have that and make them move away from the pornographic to something which isn't just sensation, but which still, like, beauty is important to me. Like blue, like with these imagery, like somebody asked, like, with the, like, why I didn't use a white background, right? Like, why is the blue? And I went to Italy a couple years ago and saw Giotto's Gravini Chapel, which is like his Sistine Chapel basically in Padua, and it's this amazing blue art, you know, vault, right? Everything's this night sky, and it was made with lapis lazuli, right? Which is like, was very expensive. And Prussian blue is the blue that replaced lapis lazuli, right? It's the cheaper version of it when it was developed. And it has this ability to kind of suck in your vision. Like, it's like you can't see it almost. It's like Vanta Black or something, right? Like, it is able to kind of like suck you into it, to feel like you are under a night sky, or that you are, it has this physiological effect that color can have, that is hard to put into words because it's color, right? It's like, it does something on a phenomenological level that we can't quite explain. And
I will say, as an indigenous person, I found the use of the blue particularly telling, because of the fact that in most Southwest cultures, this shade of blue is extremely sacred to people.
Really? I was unaware of that.
Well, yeah, the blue world is where the Southwestern peoples come from. The ancestral pueblos, their first world was blue. That's where they came from, and that's where they're returning to.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So much to learn.
And
Tell me more.
I'm sure you'll hang out for a bit, Nancy. I know
Yeah.
this is like a lot. You've given us all so much to think about and talk about. So thank you so much for, yeah.